Okay, we're finally ready to talk about Mixdown and export. There are a couple of fundamentals I want to touch on before we even open the export dialog window. The first is remember that Cubase will only export material between the locators, so it's important to have those two white triangles positioned appropriately. Remember, however, that you do need to extend this out far enough to capture any reverb tail or fade out that may be generated by one of the plugins. All right, the second thing that I want to discuss is the concept of dither. Okay, if we look at an analog waveform, it's a continuously variable curve. Now, if we're going to take that and convert it to digital, by definition, we're going to have to break it into stair steps. And those stair steps are defined by sample rate and bit depth. The sample rate is how many times per second the audio is recorded, and the bit depth is how much information per second can be encoded. And this is not drawn to scale, but you can see that at a low sample rate or a low bit depth, there's going to be a big delta between the actual analog sound and its digital representation. Now, one way to combat that is by using a higher sample rate and a higher bit depth. And that gets the smaller stair steps, which become increasingly closer to the original analog waveform. And as a point of reference, the industry standard for CD quality audio is 44,000 kilohertz, technically 44.1, and 16 bits of depth. Now, if you think about a lo-fi sound or some of the plugins like Bit Crusher, these are the bits that they're talking about because the fewer bits that you use or the slower clock you use, slower sample rate, the chunkier the sound becomes. But it never, even at extremely high clock speeds and bit depths, it approaches perfection, but it's never going to achieve a perfect curve. So the way that we can go about smoothing off those stair steps so that the human ear perceives it as perfect or nearly perfect is by the introduction of a carefully shaped noise called dither. Now, I know it seems completely counterintuitive to suggest that our recording quality could become higher or better by introducing noise, but that's exactly what happens with dither. And you can think of it as a form of audio camouflage. And what's important to remember is that the dither noise is, as a rule of thumb, generated at a frequency above the range of human hearing. And oddly enough, that still works to smooth off the edges and give the impression of smooth sound. But that being said, we are still introducing noise. Okay, so with that in mind, the next thing that we need to do is configure our project to dither appropriately. We're going to do that by opening the channel editor for the stereo output. We're going to go to the insert rack and to the very last slot because it's important that you dither, but it's important that you only do it once. And in this very last slot, which is post fader, we're going to open that up. We're going to open up the mastering section and drop in the UV22. This is Steinberg's built-in mastering plugin, dithering plugin. And this has two sets of controls, an output bit depth and then high, low, and black for the dither level. And it's important that you match the output to whatever your final format is going to be. Now, in this case, if we're working for a CD, we want to set that to 16 because the CD standard is 16 bits. In terms of high and low, the rule of thumb is that the greater the change from what you recorded at to what you're outputting to, the more dithering noise you need to cover up those stair steps. And in most cases, low is probably going to be sufficient. And the last control we have here is this option for auto black. And what that does is during extended periods of silence, the plugin will pick up on the fact that there's no sound to dither, no processing going on, and it'll turn off the noise generator completely so that you don't get any background hiss between tracks or during completely dead passages in your music. So we'll turn that on just as a safety. Okay, with that in place, we're now ready to look at exporting. Okay, our export tools are found under the File menu, and if we come down to Export, you see there are a lot of options, everything from exporting a MIDI loop down to the notepad data. And what we want for most mixdowns is going to be this option, the audio mixdown. So if we open this window and work from left to right, the very first thing that we have to choose is which channels. Now at the very top is an option for batch channel export so that you're going to send each channel out or whatever channels you select into their own files. And we'll look at that one in just a second. But for most mixdowns, you're just going to select the stereo out option. Then you're going to give it a name here, choose a path, which is just simply where you want the final file to end up. And then you have an option for naming scheme. And we looked at this in the new features section early on in the videos, but you can drag and drop all of these variables down. And what this does is append the metadata about the project to the file name. And this is particularly useful if you're sending the information downstream to somebody else who's got to work with it, so you can bake in the channel number and channel type and so forth. If you're just using this for your own demo purposes, you probably don't need much more than just the name. Now, the most confusing dropdown in this whole thing for most people is the file format. Unless you're familiar with what all these abbreviations mean, this is a little bit intimidating. And I would say that the one most people are familiar with is the MPEG-1 Layer 3 file, which is the longhand version of an MP3. Now, an MP3 is a highly compressed file, and it's remarkable how much data they squeeze out of this. It's about 80% omitted. The fact that it works at all is amazing. But you have a choice here again of setting a bit rate, and about 128 is industry standard for most MP3s, as well as a sample rate. And again, 44.1 is going to be your default. And then you have the option to insert an ID3 tag. This is another set of metadata. If you click this, you can add all of these different variables, album, genre, and so forth, so that it'll be baked in. So if you then open this on your iPhone or your MP3 player, those are the bits of text that will scroll across the screen. Now, the big advantage to the MP3 with that high compression rate is that it's a very small file. There is a loss of quality, but if you're just shooting demos around and so forth, it's more than enough. The WAV file at the top is an uncompressed file. So this is going to give you your highest audio quality, but the file is going to be huge compared to its MP3 cousin. Now, the AIFF is essentially the Macintosh native uncompressed file. So if you're working in a Windows environment, probably the WAV file is where you're going to go for your real high resolution stuff. And here again, you can insert what they call a broadcast wave chunk, which is more metadata that'll be encoded with your file. So wherever it goes, somebody can, click and get info about it and so forth. If we select AIFF, you still have this same metadata option, but a little different layout of how those variables are covered. Then the other couple of options that you should be aware of here are flac and the OGG Vorbis. The OGG Vorbis is an open file format. It's common in a lot of sharing platforms. But flac is a relatively recent introduction, and the flac format is highly compressed like the MP3, but with almost no quality loss. And the flac file format, you think you're going to see is going to become increasingly popular in the future because it's sort of the best of both worlds. It's considerably smaller than an uncompressed file, but it doesn't have the noticeable drop in quality that an MP3 does. So for the moment, we'll leave this at the WAV file. And then we have the audio engine output options. And this is where you're going to set your bit depth sample rate for the file. Now, if we're going to a CD, 44 and 16 is what we want. Just as a point of reference, if you're working on video or film, 32 is the accepted, 48 is the accepted standard for the audio components of a film and video project, and 44.1 for CD. But you can set these based on what your client or your final project output looks like. The options for mono, down mix, and split channels and so forth are going to be determined by what happens next with the file. And then you have the option here with import into pool. You can have the final Mixdown file copied back into the pool for this, so it's sort of kept there for all time, and you can even have it added back in as an audio track if you want. And then the last section of this window is post-process. And there are a couple of options here. You can, if you give it the appropriate account data, have this Mixdown automatically uploaded to your SoundCloud account, or you can open it in Wavelab, which is Steinberg's mastering utility. And Wavelab would, if you compose your individual songs in Cubase, you would stitch them together into an album using Wavelab. So if you have both programs running on your system, you can send it right to Wavelab and begin putting stuff together, which is actually fairly neat capability. Once you have all your settings, you're going to simply click Export, and it takes just a couple of minutes, and whatever's between those markers and activated is going to be included in the file. And while it's doing this, I should point out, if you have any channels muted over here when you export, then they're not going to be included in the final file. It's what you see is what you get. And along those same lines, if you're using any external synthesizers, you're going to have to use the option to export in real time because it's going to have to actually sit there and play the whole song, generate the MIDI notes, and then capture the sound coming back in order for it to work. Okay, with that being said, let's close this all up hide it for a second and take a look what we found. Here's the WAV file on the desktop. And if I right-click on that and select Get Info, this is where any metadata that we included would show up. And I just want to show you two other things really quickly here. The option for file export selected tracks, what I did was select the pad track and two others here. And collectively, that involves 21 different audio or MIDI clips, 7 per track, selected 3 tracks. And in that case, what was generated here was a folder with a media file and actually only 14 items. If you elect to use the option for export selected tracks, it's only going to export audio, and it's going to export every single audio event as a separate file. So you're not going to get complete mixed tracks. You're not going to get a complete project. You're going to get each little event exported on its own, and it ignores the MIDI. Now, by comparison, when we if we do a channel batch export, which is what this folder contains, it's going to output all of the files, and that includes things like this pad track that originated as a MIDI file. So it mixed that down, it converted the MIDI to audio, and it spat it out as an independent WAV file along with the selected audio files. So we here have each track start to finish in its own file, so that somebody maybe working in another DAW could bring these in, place them in their DAW and mix it in their environment or what have you. But the big difference there is that the export selected track output audio only, and it put every event into its own file. The batch channel export option gave us completely mixed channels, including the MIDI stuff converted to audio. Okay, well that brings us to the end of complete Cubase 8.5, but certainly not to the end of what Cubase is capable of delivering. If you're an advanced or professional user, I want to invite you back here to the StreamWorks Audio Masterclass series, where we'll get in depth with some of the really advanced capabilities in the near future. In the meantime, I want to thank you for your time. It's been a real privilege to share this with you. On behalf of everybody here at StreamWorks Audio, thanks for being a StreamWorks customer, and thanks for watching.